His English teacher had initiated a discussion about temptation. And the gist of his classwork centered on the line from the Lord's Prayer, the one that goes, "And lead us not into temptation." As I remember it, the question posed by the teacher asked something on the order of this: what kind of God would do such a thing? That question thrust a writing assignment into an important theological reflection. Knowing the instructor as I did, that his question represented his own cynical position, I felt the need to offer a counterpoint to our shared student. In the hope that you too have wondered from time to time about the pertinence of that line in the Lord's Prayer, don't you wish you had $1 for every time you said it? And then give me $1.25 for the times you didn't understand it? Because I still have college tuition to pay. Let me pose a different question to you. Is temptation bad? Spoiler alert. The answer is no. But before we answer that answer can be appreciated or even debated, we need to ask other questions, such as, what is the role of temptation in the Genesis story we've heard? It would be most helpful to understand what temptation is from a biblical and theological perspective. I say this because without such an understanding, our Old Testament lesson from the Genesis story, known popularly as the Fall, becomes just another biblical cartoon. It either becomes something to be ignored as too primitive for sophisticated folks like us, or it is scorned as another example of manipulative patrimony operating under the guise of biblical religion. So, before addressing this issue of temptation, let me pause here and offer a contextual sidebar. Let me suggest 3 general options for interpreting such things, perhaps for interpreting all things. The first interpretive option is a literal one. This is to say that the words on the page mean what they say. For instance, if you and I were walking along a steep, unguarded cliff and suddenly I yelled, "Stop!" you may do well to do just that. Literal interpretation of such situations is most important, at least until there is the opportunity to evaluate the danger. Even in the cliff-walking example, once the admonition to stop is taken, it still remains to be seen whether or not such a scream was helpful or even appropriate. So it is not only inadequate, but misleading when people establish such things as the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, purporting that the origin of the universe is expressed by the literal interpretation of the Bible's Genesis creation narrative. This literal interpretation of the Genesis story creates a huge problem. Is the story's purpose and meaning a matter of explaining how the creation occurred? Or was it meant to be a description of something deeper, much larger, not of how, but why? Many of us desire to address the question of why from a biblical perspective. Moreover, many of us cannot ignore the fact that Genesis was never meant to be a scientific explanation of life, much less ignore the impact of the physical data that seemingly contradict a literal interpretation. So another perspective is sought: metaphor. In this perspective, what the Bible said was seen often as a metaphor, a poetic image. Now, as with all good literature, the Bible does contain stunning poetic metaphor, to describe realities that surpass human precision. But the problem still remains. What caused the need for a metaphor in the first place? For instance, it is one thing to admire the beauty of the ripples in a pond. But what impact first caused the ripples? In other words, where's the beef to which the metaphor points? So given the limitations both of interpreting the Bible and reality itself in literal or metaphorical manners, many of us seek a third way of interpretation. Namely, what does it take to view the text, the story, the person, the situation seriously? This, I'm suggesting, is the third way of interpretation, and it should come to some surprise to you after 19 months of being together. That's what I do, or try to do. End of sidebar. Being mindful of how we interpret things, and now returning to the essay question, what are we to make of the phrase that Jesus himself taught? The one about petitioning God not to lead us into temptation. What does it mean? How shall we regard it? A serious reading of the Genesis creation story reveals that life with God contains three elements. Elements that, when held mindfully in balance with one another, provide life as God intends it to be. The first element of being made in God's image and being God's partner in creation is vocation. According to Genesis, humanity's God-given vocation or purpose is to be fruitful and multiply, to till the earth and subdue it, that is, to take charge of the earth and be responsible caretakers of what God has made. Within this first element of vocation, of calling, of purpose, there also lies the second element, the permission God gives to be the Creator's stewards. Specifically, the garden that was made was given to the man Adam and the woman Eve. Their job was to take care of the garden, and God had given them permission to use the garden for their sustenance and recreation. But one thing in the garden was prohibited. They were not to touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The penalty for broaching this prohibition was death. Prohibition was the third element to the garden life. In order that there be fruitful, abundant, and enduring life for humans, God prohibited Adam and Eve from being God. Such is the context and setting of this morning's story. Next comes the decisive and dramatic action. Enter the serpent, along with the issue of temptation. Come back next week. We'll talk about this. As I already said to you, temptation is not bad. I did say that. In fact, in terms of morality, that is, in terms of what's right and wrong, temptation is neutral. I say this because temptation merely offers humanity, represented by Adam and Eve, the opportunity to choose. And the fundamental choice, which makes us human, according to the Genesis story, is whether or not humanity chooses to replace God. In other words, temptation provides opportunities either to honor God at the center or to tell the Holy One, "You're fired." With this in mind about temptation, we're now in a position to move forward to the meaning of what our morning lessons say about temptation. The serpent enters the scene acting like the shrewdest of high-paid lawyers, and asks a question to which he already knows the answer. The serpent asks his leading question, "Do I understand that God told you not to eat from any tree in the garden?" Now, closely paying attention to the story, you and I already know the answer, and so does Eve. Like a proud fourth grader who has memorized her homework assignment, Eve stands confidently by her desk and tells the teacher, that is the serpent, her memorized answer. "Not at all," she says. "We can eat from the trees of the garden. It's only the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, don't eat it, don't even touch it, or you'll die." And that's the right answer. Tell her what she's won, Johnny. Memorizing is an important first step in learning. Yet unless we are willing to live what we're learning, we remain vulnerable to people who always have more information than we do, more experience than we do, more shrewdness and cleverness than we do. Eve was a good girl. She knew her lessons, but when it came time to living her lessons, she wasn't ready for that. And as a result, neither was she ready to handle temptation. Hearing innocent Eve's answer, one can almost see the sly smile on the serpent's face. I think of the malignant grin on the Grinch who stole Christmas when he had the idea of how to ruin Christmas for the residents of Whoville. With a soft, syrupy voice spoken through haughty lips, the serpent told Eve that if they ate of that forbidden fruit, they would not die. On the contrary, they would be like God. And you know what? The serpent was correct. What wasn't said, however, was what replacing God would require. Adam and Eve broke faith with God. They chose to contravene God's prohibition. Their fall is a fundamental matter of who or what stands at the center of life. Is it the author of life or a copywriter? This is the fundamental choice in life, for life, about life. As I've said to you many times before, everyone is religious. The problem is what we worship, what we hold at the center. To choose to replace God at the center is what sin is. As in a Shakespearean tragedy, the main theme with sin is usurpation of the king. When the rightful king is replaced, chaos and death ensue. This is much more than a moral issue. It is an existential one, a reality issue. Being our own gods, what shall we do, for instance, when we face death? As Peggy Lee opined years and years ago, is that all there is? Every Sunday school student is taught that God is love. And God is love because God wants partners, not puppets. Love means that we can and do choose to replace the Holy One in our lives. And as a result, God suffers in his love because of our choices. The cross indicates just how much God does suffer and God does love. And the last point is that in his temptation, Jesus steadfastly chooses to have God at the center, taking no shortcuts in terms of his relationship with the Father. Jesus would rather die than betray God. And in that quiet victory at the end of this morning's gospel lesson, Satan, a word that means the adversary, realized that he could not ruin Jesus as he had ruined the parents of the human race. And what this means is that Satan knew then that he could not stop God's plan of redemption, which God embodied, which Jesus is. And that, folks, is the good news for today and for every day. Amen.